Welcome to the in-between,
where shift happens,
the moment between where we are
and where we are going.
We will ask all the questions,
maybe find some answers,
and generally work at being okay.
In the mystery of the in-between. Poverty. And I am so excited. A special guest, Reverend Kris Alexander, is with us today for this conversation. And so if you haven't joined in before, kind of the shtick of this whole thing is this idea of the in-between, because that's where life happens. That's where everything sort of happens between where we are and where we're moving towards. And sometimes that in-between can look messy and all the things in between. And so for this podcast, we've agreed on a topic, but Kris doesn't know the questions I'm going to ask. And so that kind of is allowing us to kind of be in the moment in the in-between. So what she did know that I was going to ask is for her to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her work in the world, and why is this topic, the myth of poverty, like, why is this so important in our current time, especially within the context of in-between and spirituality and all the things? So I'm going to that was like a lot of question, but I'm going to throw it at you, Kris, and let you take it for a minute.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. Yes. So, hello, I am Reverend Kris Alexander. I am one of the meta ministers at Soul Evolution Collaborative. And I do several things in the world, but the thing that I'm focusing on today is my work as a curriculum development specialist for Circles USA, which is an incredible national nonprofit that works to eradicate poverty. Hence why I came on to talk about the myths of poverty. And it's very interesting because I've done a lot of curriculum development. And so I, had this opportunity to do this work, but I didn't have actually a whole lot of understanding of poverty or the impact of poverty on our world, or the impact of the world on poverty, just all of the things, until I really started this position. And I have learned so much. And I think there's a lot of myths and misconceptions around poverty, people in poverty, how people of poverty or people in poverty end up in poverty, or what it's like to be in poverty, just all of the things. And I've been really shocked to hear, now that I know a little more, I've been really shocked to hear some of the beliefs and ideas of people, especially people kind of in our spiritual communities. In America specifically, we kind of have this mentality of the American dream, that anybody who works hard can make it, quote unquote, make it in the world and be successful, sort of in that traditional mindset of success, of having enough money, the house with the picket fence and the 2.5 kids with the dog and the cat and the this and the that. We have this idea, we've been taught, if you just work hard enough, then you'll have those things. And that's not true. That is a myth, and is absolutely not true for everybody in the world. And so I think in our spirituality, where, we have, if we're holding some of these myths about other people and about poverty, then when we do our spiritual work, or when we approach the world from a spiritual position, if we have the wrong fundamental ideas about people, then we're not going to be supportive, or supportive of people in the work that we're doing. So I think that this is a really important conversation to have for everybody. I think it's really important for us to understand how the world works for a majority of people. And then once we understand that at a more fundamental level, then we can actually support and make the world a place that works for everyone, understanding why it doesn't and what needs to happen.
Yeah, and I think that it's also like that it's important. I think that's kind of some of what you're saying, this sort of this conversation. Um, because often I think we react or live from assumptions.
Yeah.
That's true like across the board. And I think that when we do that, then it really is detrimental to not only ourselves individually, because we're operating on something that is not true or may not be true, but it also collectively it doesn't support the type of world that we are wanting to move in. And I think conversations, especially in the United States, around this idea of poverty, unhoused, um, those sorts of conversations, there's a lot of assumptions that really keep us from really leaning into the experiences of one another. There's a lot of assumptions. And so what happens is it creates this like those people over there,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And like or look what I'm doing because I've achieved these things in my life because I've worked hard and I've got a degree and whatever, without really looking at the underlying like systems and frameworks that have supported certain individuals in those things and then have disproportionately marginalized other people.
Yes.
That this idea that's picking up by your bootstraps or just work harder or, you know, I paid off my student loans, everyone should be able to, right? It's like that sort of idea
Yes.
that we go into this assumption, I think this is the big assumption. Maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong in like the work you're doing. The big assumption is that we all start off clean slate and equal playing field. And maybe that's like the biggest myth, the myth of all myths, I think. What do you think? What do you think about that? I mean, for me, that just seems like the starting point of it.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's the starting point. The myth of all myths. I don't know. I'm like, there's so many of them and they're so detrimental. But yeah, I would say that that's a huge one that everybody has this idea that that we all start off on a level playing field and that people who get ahead are getting ahead just because they are better in some way. They're working harder, they're smarter, they're more motivated, they have better willpower, all of that. That is completely false. So yeah, I guess that would be kind of the jumping off point for all of the other myths is this idea that we all are on an equal starting point.
So what's another myth? Let's just start working through some of the myths in the time that we have because I really want us to um like hear them and then like lean into them, lean into the discomfort that we may feel because oh shit, we've been living from that myth too, right? And so I think it's important to like let's just name them and like see where it takes us. So let's start myth number one in no particular order.
In no particular order. Well, so actually, this is myth number two, right? Because myth number one is that hard work leads to success,
Yeah.
and that everybody starts out
Whatever
equal.
success is, right? Like
Right.
quotation mark success.
The sort of traditional definition of plenty of money,
Right.
economic status, those things. I would say myth number two is that poor people or people who are living in poverty are lazy and just want handouts from hardworking people. This is one that I hear oh so much, and it's so untrue. What so many people don't understand is if you have never been in the experience of poverty or not having enough resources to make ends meet, it is hard. I did that. I was a single mom in my early 20s. I did not have the resources I needed to make ends meet. At the time, I never would have said that I was in poverty because I had so many beliefs about what that meant, all of which were myths and untrue. But now looking back, I'm like, yes, I was in poverty. That was a thing that I was experiencing. And what I know about myself and the people that I was living around and in community with is that we were so hardworking. Most people in poverty have at least one job, usually 2 or 3 jobs. And they are resourceful and incredibly intelligent and absolutely don't want handouts for the most part. Of course, there's always going to be outliers, right? In anything. I mean, there are rich people that just want handouts, right? Like this is generalizations that we're talking about. But for the most part, the people that I have known and know now just want to be equally supported and equally resourced as others for the amount of work that they are doing in the world. There is something called ALICE. It's asset limited, income constrained, employed. So it's basically the working poor, right? Asset limited. So you have limited resources, income constrained. You have an income, it's just small. Employed, you have at least one job. The majority, I think, I did not look up this statistic and I should have, but I'm pretty sure that like 92% of people living under the federal poverty level are employed. So the idea that people who are in poverty are just lazy and just want handouts is absolutely false. The majority of people are working, are trying their best, are doing what they can. And for that small percentage of folks who aren't, it very often is not that they are just lazy and wanting handouts. They have mental health challenges or disabilities, or they're trying to care for family members who are either, small children or ailing family members or elders or parents, or they're in transition or something has happened, or they're, experiencing some sort of domestic violence or something like that. So very few people on the planet across the board want to just sit around and do nothing and expect everything to be handed to them.
What do you think? Because I think with these myths, as we're starting to talk about them, in my brain, it's like the thing that's underlying, like that is the emotion or the belief or the idea underneath the myth that keeps it churning. It's like that, the ever burning flame, right? That thing that keeps on circling underneath that myth.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is that thing that keeps on circling underneath this myth? Like, what is it?
Mm.
What is the benefit of not only believing this myth, but like, what is it the benefit for the folks that believe this myth, that it's just that? Does that make sense, that question?
Yeah, I think that's a really hard question to answer, just like, here's the thing.
Right.
I think, well, two things. Our society, like our country itself, and really the world, but our country specifically, is built on people being in poverty. Our country and our economics cannot survive without having a working poor.
Mm.
Absolutely cannot happen. It is impossible. So, so really, that is the thing. That is the thing that is keeping all of this the way that it is. It's the reason that we don't have poverty solutions. We have poverty management coming from our government, because all of us, every single person who is not in poverty, is benefiting from the working poor. Every time that we expect to get cheap goods for low prices
Yep.
from people, every time we walk into Starbucks and expect our coffee to only be $3, $5, $7, whatever it may be, every time we do that, we are operating our lives on the backs of the working poor. And it's gotten even worse, right? Because now, I mean, they're talking about how inflation literally is a result of it's greedflation, right? So inflation is literally happening because of the 1% and CEOs and things like that trying to get richer. So yes, it is absolutely worse because of all of that. But the reality is that when we look at this and we say, oh, this is a rich people problem, or this is a problem that people in the upper class or the 1% need to solve, it's only, really benefiting them. That's not true. Every single thing, every Amazon package that arrives, every Starbucks coffee, every single time that we shop at Walmart or any of that, we are benefiting from having a working poor class in our country, period.
And that reality is like, I mean, folks may be hearing that like, what is going on, right? But that is the reality. And I think that's the important piece in this conversation. Even beyond the myths of poverty, even beyond like just the specifics of our conversation today, this idea that my life and the decisions I make just affect me. They don't affect everyone else. So, right. So it's this,
Absolutely.
once again, we talk about it a lot, but this is like this really individualistic sort of framework, which I think oftentimes we also can kind of get into, especially in spiritual communities and religious organizations, religious communities, churches. So, I mean, like across the board, regardless of, especially here in the United States and the mainstream sort of spirituality and religious movements, is this idea that you go and you get yours, you take care of your own life or your own beliefs, your own whatever, and then right as if it is
Yeah.
separate from
Right.
the world around us. And I think this conversation and exactly what you have said is the stark reality that we are not separate from one another. The decisions I make, what I buy, what I support, what I put my money towards, my energy toward, like it directly affects people that I will never
Everybody
meet,
else. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
also affects like generations from now because we continue to perpetuate this system.
Yes. Well, and it's, I'm absolutely not saying like if you shop at Amazon or Walmart or you expect your coffee to be reasonably priced that
Right,
you are a
right.
bad person, right? But this is the system that we are living in.
Yeah.
One of my favorite phrases is there is no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism. Maybe at one time there was, but at this point, all of us are living in a system that is harmful to a large majority of us.
Yeah.
And we're all doing the best we can. I totally understand that. And if we want to not have our economy based on the backs of other people, then the economy is going to have to change at its fundamental level. And I think it's also really, really important to point out that this has been the system in America from the day that the colonizers hit the ground running in this country, right? Like this country was built on the backs of enslaved people. This country was built by people who were not paid for their work. And so, over the years, it's shifted, and absolutely the system uh, disproportionately impacts marginalized and oppressed communities, especially people of color, especially Black folks and Indigenous folks, because that's the system that was started back hundreds of years ago. The country was built with enslaved people without them getting paid in horrible conditions, not just not getting paid, right? But like horrible, horrifying conditions that most of us cannot even imagine at this point in our lives. And then from there, it shifted to the economy that we had, with still primarily marginalized and oppressed communities not getting proportionately paid for the work that they were inputting, and that still continues today. And now we have things like the gig economy and the service workers and all of what we are seeing today is an offshoot, a descendant of the fact that this country was built on with enslaved people.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's another myth? We talked about Not
Oh,
really sure I wasn't sure how to segue into that, but I really want us to, like,
yeah,
continue to, like, explore some of these myths because I think, it's really important for us to bring them to light.
absolutely. I think I'm gonna kind of roll these two into one, which is
Okay.
that people in poverty are unintelligent and or just need to get an education. That's one that I often hear, and really I think we have confabulated that having a higher education equals intelligence in this country. That is absolutely not true. And despite the fact that we see over and over and over again that it's not true, Bill Gates doesn't have a higher education, Mark Zuckerberg doesn't have a higher education, right? Like all of these people who have made it, white men, right? And yet we still perpetuate this myth of, oh, well, if you want a better job, just go get an education. Despite the fact that, on top of the fact that you don't need an education to be successful, but also there are a huge majority of people who have a higher education who are still a part of the working poor, who are still in that Alice demographic, right? Because at this day and age, having an education does not lead to success in the same way that maybe it did back in the 60s and 70s. Maybe it never did. I wasn't there, right? But just going and getting an education and to just tell people, well, if you want a better job, if you don't want to work in the service industry, if you don't want to serve that coffee, just go get a better job, just go get an education and then get a better job. That's not the way it works. And our education costs like thousands of times more than it did back in the 60s and 70s, right? So to just go get an education is A, not feasible for a lot of people, and B, not going to guarantee success or a better job.
Well, and it's a very privileged mindset of like, "Oh, just go do something
Right.
different," as if, once again, this idea that there is a level playing field.
Right.
Um, and also, it's like, "Oh, just get a good education or just get a better job." Um, it's kind of that "just get over it" mentality of
Yes.
like, "Yeah, it looks like it's hard for you. We'll just get over it and go do something else." Yeah, that would be really, like, great if we could do that, and so what I think it does is that mindset to those really lived experiences of individuals, it really is, not validating to the really lived experiences, and it comes from this privileged mindset, and in this conversation, we all have to, check our own privilege and how that influences how we approach this conversation, this idea, how we interact with people, how we lean into the experiences of other individuals. And it also kind of maybe shakes up our own viewpoint of the world, right? If
Absolutely.
the truth is that you can't if the truth is that there it is not an equal playing field, then sometimes we have to deal with own reality of, wow, this experience could be my own in like a snap, right? And I think
Mhm.
sometimes it is the fear of that because we don't
Yeah,
wanna look at that, kind of like when we wanna normalize conversations around death, sometimes we don't wanna talk about death because it makes us face our own mortality. The same
absolutely.
sort of situation in this is like, wow, if I actually believe that this system and framework is broken, then that means at some point, boom, I could have the impact of that broken system, and so I think sometimes it's a head in the sand because, "Oh, well, that's not me, so I don't have to worry about that." Um,
Absolutely. I would say that, especially in spiritual communities, especially in spiritual communities that believe things like we can create our own reality, we are so terrified of being out of control of our own lives that we
mhm.
have to find a way to blame people that are in bad situations for the situations they're in, because otherwise we would have to acknowledge that, yes, that could happen to me too.
Well, I think that leads into another myth, that if and this could be not just, poverty, but any sort of situation where we view something as not right or wrong or whatever, that it must be something that that person did. So
Absolutely.
we're like
Right.
moralizing success, basically, that
Right.
if you're successful, you're good. If you have challenges or whether it's navigating the system or just challenges in your own life, then you've done, it's something you have done. So speak more to that myth. I don't know if I've verbalized it, but that just is something that comes to mind for me.
Absolutely. Well, and that myth that people who are in bad circumstances did something to deserve being there, and maybe sometimes, but the reality is that we all make bad decisions. Like, all of us have made mistakes. All of us have made terrible decisions. All of us have had something that highly impacted our lives. However, the difference is that for people in poverty, when those things happen, there's no safety net. And so automatically the impact of things happening, whether it was a bad decision on that person's part, or life just happening, or a broken system, or being oppressed intentionally by a system that we say is broken, but actually it's working exactly as it was intended to work. We just
Right.
don't think that's the way it should work, right? Regardless, there's no safety net. So I was watching this really interesting video the other day about fines and fees. And, two people get pulled over for speeding. They each get a $200 speeding ticket, right? Well, somebody that has $200 of disposable income, they pay the $200, they go along on their merry way, right? But for somebody who does not have $200 of disposable income, then they have to take a whole day off at work to go sit in court. Then they have to do a payment plan, which has high interest rates. So now all of a sudden they're paying $400 for that $200 speeding ticket. Then if they miss a payment, because they had to, feed their children or pay an electric bill, then they get a warrant out for their arrest. Then they get arrested. Then they're in jail. Then they lose their job. Then they lose their home. Then they lose their children, right? All over a $200 speeding ticket that for a lot of us, not a big deal at all. But for those who don't have $200, there's no safety net. And we can't say, oh, well, if you don't have $200 to speed, just don't speed. That's a ridiculous thing. And I think sometimes we do that, right? We try to say, oh, well, it's your fault for speeding. Like we ourselves have never sped or broken a law in the
Right.
car, right? And so yeah, this idea that you deserve where you ended up, like, is not correct. And that's true. The majority of people in the prison system in America and the jail system are there for nonviolent crimes that are because they were poor and couldn't pay fines and fees. Like that's the reality of the situation. And so there's just no safety net. And that's the other thing, before the lazy, the just need to go get an education, all of that, it is such a privilege to take a leap of faith. Like the amount of safety net that people that are like, just leap out, just step out, just do the thing, it'll all work out. That's because you have a safety net. And if it doesn't work out, you'll be okay. But
Yeah.
for somebody who is especially generational poverty, for somebody who is in extreme poverty or just poverty period, there's no taking risks, because taking a risk, stepping out like that, might mean that your child goes hungry, or might mean that your ill mother dies, or might mean that your family ends up homeless. It's not, oh, if it doesn't work out, you can just go back to whatever. No, it's real hardcore impacts of just step out, just take a leap of faith, just take a risk.
Yeah. And I think it just I mean, that whole, like, just that the story of the $200 fine, right? I mean, that is the thing. I mean, that is the reality of the impact of certain things, and the impact is not the same for all of us. And I think that is the important that just highlights the importance of really looking into these myths and what does it say about us, right? Because if I can moralize and blame someone, it's the same back to what we were talking about having control over our own lives. Because if I can say, oh, that happened just because they were a bad person, then I could be like, oh, I'm a good person, then that can't happen to me. Right.
Absolutely.
So I think it is that weird sort of way of calming our own fears about like the very real reality up and down experiences of life that can happen to any of us.
Yeah.
It's this really interesting need to insulate ourselves from challenge, and I think and I think honestly that's where some of these myths come to. It's that us and them, us
Mhm.
and them, us and this, us and them, and so whenever we create the us and them, then we can be very insulated and cuddly and all warm and cozy in our us because we're not them.
Right. Right.
And so I think that that's kind of this underlying mentality.
Well, and that I think it can be really painful for white people when we realize, because the majority of people in not the majority of people in poverty, that is incorrect. I take that back. Actually, the majority of people in poverty are white people because there's so many more white people in our country. However, the percentages of people of color in poverty are higher, right? So 10% of white people are living in poverty, but 25% of Black individuals are living in poverty. So it's still more, per person, white people, but per populations, it's, disproportionately affecting people of color, specifically Black people and Indigenous people and Hispanic, Latina people. And I think it can be really hard for white people to kind of say, oh, this system really disproportionately affects people of color. Why is that? How long ago did that start? Which enslavement, right? And there have been laws that continue to be passed today that harm people of color more than white people, or that benefit white people and harm people of
Yeah.
color. Um, just the other day, I read an article that literally it made my stomach turn. That the NFL has like Alzheimer's
But CTE, yeah.
fund that they pay out if one of their former players gets not dyslexia, dementia, or Alzheimer's, or some sort of something as a relation to all of the traumatic brain injuries and concussions that happen in the NFL. They get a payout for that, right? Well, most Black NFL players, which the majority of NFL players are Black, do not get that payout until 2020. This law was changed in 2021 because they were using different intelligence meters for white players and Black players that automatically assumes that the Black players were of lower intelligence than the white players. And so then they started them at a lower baseline intelligence, saying that Black people are not as smart as white people. And then when they did the testing, they said, oh, actually, that dementia, that traumatic brain injury hasn't actually really impacted your life that much because you weren't actually that smart to begin with. Literally until 2021, the NFL was doing this. So it's like for us to say, oh, well, that was back in the day. No, it's still happening today.
Yeah. Well, and we've talked about a lot of like heavy stuff,
Yes.
right? And so I would love for us to kind of bring the conversation back around and kind of conclude this conversation. Like, what can we do? What
Mhm.
can we do in these conversations uh, around the myths of poverty, and what is ours to do? And I think that ours is for everyone to look at what it is their role is to do in this conversation. But what can we begin? What are some of the things that we can do to begin to shift maybe our own mentality, our own ways, our own interactions with this conversation?
Well, I would say the number one first thing is to grow our own education and awareness of these issues, and to begin to just notice when you see a statistic that maybe is going to buy allow you to buy in a little more to your biases. Something like, that the majority of people incarcerated in America are Black men, and instead of, I think oftentimes what the initial thought is, well, if you're incarcerated, you did something to deserve that. I think that that is a pretty typical thing that we think,
Mhm.
right? And then from there it snowballs very quickly into, well, then, all those Black men must have done something to deserve to be incarcerated, and therefore Black men are just not as whatever, whatever, whatever. And to stop ourselves in that and say, actually, do I know why people are being incarcerated in America? Do I understand why we have a prison country, why we incarcerate 25% more of our population than any other country in the world, not just developing countries, period? Do I understand why that is? And then, are there laws and things happening that disproportionately affect Black men that make it so they end up incarcerated through no fault of their own? Because that's actually the truth, right? So when we start to hear these statistics, or when we hear people say things like that, to stop and say, do I actually understand this? Do I actually know why this is happening? Is this actually because that person or that population or that group of people are bad people, morally corrupt, deserve to be where they are, whatever it may be? Or is there something happening underlying, that I am unaware of? Because unfortunately, the other problem with this system that we have, that is broken according to our ethics and morality, but actually is working entirely the way it intended to, is that the people in the positions of privilege, so the white folks, the straight folks, the not marginalized and oppressed folks, don't even see it's happening. And so it's really easy when somebody tells us their lived experience and we haven't seen or experienced that ourselves, to say, no, 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 that can't be right, especially if it's something that is horrible. And
Yeah.
so instead, to believe people, to educate ourselves, to bring more awareness, to do the work. And then I would say the other thing that you can that you can do, I'm going to do a plug for Circles, because this organization is incredible. It is one of the most profound nonprofits that I have ever experienced, let alone gotten to be a part of, because Circles is not about putting another program or system in place to try to counteract poverty. Instead, Circles is all about building community. It's all about building that social capital, that networking, getting to know people, building relationships across socioeconomic lines, relationships across diverse communities, to support and uplift individuals and entire communities out of poverty and circumstances that are beyond their control. And so go to circlesusa.org and look up, because there are so many amazing ways to volunteer and to support folks that are working on living their best lives in a system that really makes it a lot harder for them to do so than for some of us, right? So, educating ourselves, finding ways to begin to shift and change those odds and those percentages and those circumstances just a little bit. And then also, it's a major election year. So I would say the other thing we don't understand, I don't think, I didn't understand before I got into this work, how much local, especially local, I'm not even talking about federal, but local and state governmental officials, how much impact they have on budgetary restraints and poverty levels and where how people are supported in the community. So really do your research, learn not only who the people running are and what their positions are, but also what does the role they're running for, what is that role in charge of in your community? How is that role going to affect the people in your community? How is that role going to affect where the money goes? And then vote your values. Vote your values and vote your newfound or continuing awareness of these challenges for people so that everybody has a better chance to succeed.
Yes, all of that. All of that. Well, this is a conversation that is just beginning, right? It's an everyday conversation that we have to engage with. It's not just a one-time listening podcast. It's an invitation for us to begin to take some of these ideas and really investigate our own biases, really look into our own where these myths are being perpetuated and cultivated in our own lives, and begin to step out in ways that may feel uncomfortable, but ways that are supportive not only for us individually, but for collectively. So thank you for this conversation. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. I think this is an important conversation. This is definitely the in-between. This is definitely, this uncomfortable area, which is sometimes is the in-between. But we know that in that when we face those uncomfortable situations, conversations, that in-between, that's where the shift happens. That's where the transformation happens. So thank you for being here, and we will see you next time on the in-between. Nobody really enjoys being in the in-between.
But thanks for being here anyway.
We may not have found all the answers,
But certainly some. And maybe more importantly,
a little shift has happened.
and the beauty of it all is that we are not alone in the in-between.
So until next time, we hope a lot of shift happens.